We have joining us Frank Trovato, and Lesley Cousins is back with us as well. So let me just introduce Frank since we've already introduced Lesley. At Infotech, Frank works with organizations in a range of industries to assess their current BCDR capabilities, define appropriate target recovery timelines, plan how to close any gaps, and create effective BCP DRP documentation. Frank provides his assistance through BCP and DRP workshops, phone advisory services, and the development of best practice guidelines, tools, and templates. Now, in addition to his BCP DRP practice, Frank provides so many things. He provides best practice advice on a range of topics, including cloud strategy and change management. And of course, you've been introduced to Lesley Cousins already. So let's invite them to discuss ensuring transformation equals business continuity.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Kalila. Good morning again, everyone. We're happy to be here to talk to you about business continuity, not just in the traditional sense of business continuity, but also from a digital transformation perspective. Now that we have made it through what we consider the worst part of the pandemic, people, we have come to the realization that we can do more through technology, and our business continuity really needs to take these into consideration. So I'm going to hand over to Frank. Good morning, Frank. Nice to see you again,
Good morning.
for you to take us through.
Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And let's just get right into this. Let me just find yeah, there we go. Let's just dive into this material. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you about this topic. And I'm going to give you a bit of a sneak peek first, what we're going to be taking away from this presentation and what I'm going to talk more about. Business transformation is changing business continuity strategy, right? So what does that mean? We have more online services, online collaboration. We have issues around, supply chain disruption that we also have to deal with as well, which leads us to takeaway number two. Despite the fact that many of us have spent much of the last couple of years working from home. I hear some people say, well, yeah, I don't need a BCP anymore, right? I'm living it. Well, we're living one type of business disruption. And we have to remember too that with the pandemic, we did have some warning, at least a week, let's say, for organizations to transition to work from home. Now, of course, IT had to undergo pull off some heroic efforts, right, to set up people to work remotely who hadn't done so before and provide collaboration tools and so on. But there was some warning, right? So it's not often we're able to plan our execution of business continuity. Usually it's kind of thrust upon us. So, bottom line is, don't let this kind of fool you, right? We still need an effective BCP. And certainly as we see other types of disruptions, um, not just from the pandemic, right? What we've seen there, but supply chain disruptions, um, again, also driven by the pandemic, but also by world events such as the war in Ukraine, and other events around the world, right? Supply chain has really been up and down last couple of years. So, what do you do if a key vendor is not available? It's also an uptick in natural disasters. And of course, we can't forget the very prevalent threat of a ransomware attack. So lots of reasons why you still need to have an effective business continuity plan. We'll talk more about that in this presentation. The last takeaway they're going to provide to you kind of upfront is flexibility is king. Organizations that already had flexible work arrangements, flexible options for delivering services, were in a much better position to respond to the pandemic when that hit, right? So that does make business continuity easier, and we'll talk more about that as well. Overall, I've divided this presentation into three parts. For the first part, we'll talk a little bit more about uh, best practices with business continuity and what a good methodology looks like. With part 2, we'll talk more about adapting to business transformation. And then part 3 will be Q&A. We'll try to save a little bit of time at the end for that. First, let's level set on some terminology. If you look at ISO standards or any framework that talks about business continuity, the expectation is that it includes the ability to execute IT recovery, that includes crisis management and so on. But practically speaking, it's much easier, it's more efficient, it just makes more sense to develop these as 3 separate plans that work together, right? A focused IT plan aimed at your IT department and how they would execute recovery, plans focused on each department and how they would resume business operations, not just in the event of an IT outage, but also any kind of disruption. And then crisis management, how do we do the initial assessment and determine that we need to invoke our disaster recovery plan or business continuity plan, as well as other types of crises that might need to be managed. But today we're going to focus on BCPs, that middle column. Now, what I want to show you on this slide is a more efficient approach to business continuity. And as it says in the title, the goal is to mitigate risk faster and expedite development of your plan. And the approach really revolves around starting with one critical department. The old expression, right? Eating the elephant one bite at a time, right? So let's start with one department, go through the normal process around defining scope, doing the impact analysis, developing response plans, identifying gaps, and so on. But we would actually take that even a step further and treat that first department as a pilot. And like any good pilot project, we're also trying to uncover issues with the process. Let's fine tune the process. Let's identify some challenges that need to be overcome as well for the whole organization, not just the pilot. So when you come out of that initial pilot, you now have a template you could follow for the rest of the organization to give the next department a jump start. And often clients I've worked with, they'll then tackle a few departments at a time and really kind of accelerate it because they had that foundation to build on. The other key outcome of this approach is we can identify issues early and tackle them earlier, right? I don't need to wait until I've assessed all 24 departments before I start to mitigate risks and address gaps, right? So questions like, how do we notify staff if an event occurs after hours? How do we provision end user devices? And now keep in mind that as many of us are going back into the workplace, right? We're not all set up from home necessarily on any given days. There's going to be a percentage of staff that are in the building, leaving their laptops there overnight because they're going to be back the next day, and then the building goes up in flames or what have you, and that's all gone. So we still need to think about how do we provision devices and so on and so forth, right? All of that. Well, guess what? Those are the same questions that are going to be asked by every single department. So we answer those questions early, address it for the whole organization, and that mitigates risk faster. And think about it this way too. If the if you had disruption, the day after the pilot ends, yeah, you're not completely done, the whole organization, but at least you have an idea of how you would respond. You have something rather than nothing, right? And that's again more practical, more efficient, much better than the traditional approach, which would be to complete that risk and business assessment for the entire organization first to understand all the different elements and so on before even starting to think about developing those response plans and addressing those risks. I mean, that's all good information that's gathered, but just takes too long and it delays mitigating the actual risk, right? That's what's wrong with that approach. And quite honestly, what I've seen with so many organizations is that when they try to take this that let's do it all at once approach, it's too big. The project is too big. um, they start to get kind of bogged down. The project stagnates and just dies, right? So, um, you know, the approach on the top half of the slide is what I would recommend. Keeps the momentum going, shows results sooner, and gives you a foundation to build on. Now, this slide expands on some of the elements of that methodology in more detail. I'm not going to really explore these the content very much here, right? This is more for you to have as a takeaway, because I know there's a lot of other content that we want to talk about. But at a very high level, right? Phase one, you're defining scope. Let's identify process and dependencies. Let's understand what normal looks like, so we know what has to be recovered, right? You can't define workarounds if you don't know what the normal is, right? Phase two, do the impact analysis, prioritize processes, what has to be recovered and resumed on day one versus day 4, day 5. Phase three, developing those response plans and identifying projects to close gaps. So phase 1 to 3 really are the pilot, and then phase 4 is how do we build on that for the rest of the organization, as well as rounding out the BCP for that initial pilot department. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a department. It could be a service area or other form of business unit. The key is you're tackling BCP kind of one step at a time, right? Keep it manageable. Okay, so some of the elements of an effective business continuity plan. Let's talk about some of that here on this slide, right? So the impact analysis, I mentioned that already. And by the way, it doesn't have to be as onerous as you might think. The recovery workflow and recovery playbook, right? Those are the two elements that really form the core of your actual recovery plans. And the idea is that workflow that provides the incident commanders, the team leads, that high level view of what the strategy is going to be, so they can coordinate recovery, monitor progress. It's also a very good resource when you're developing your plan to identify the resources that you're going to need to recover, right? So you can have those resources available, planned up front, right? Let's not have chaos during the crisis if we can avoid or at least minimize that. And then the playbook expands on that, provides more of the detail that the teams need to execute that workflow. A much better, more dynamic, more concise, more effective approach than that traditional 4-inch red binder that sits on a shelf collecting dust. And then along the bottom row here, the relocation checklist and other checklists like that summarize what assets are required, and so on. And then there's the project roadmap to close gaps, right? We need to think about, as we all know, a business continuity plan should be a living, breathing document. So we want to review it at least annually, right? We're on to testing. Those reviews and testing are going to always identify some opportunities for improvement at the very least. Let's get them on the roadmap and build that out. Then the summary document is a really important part of this whole puzzle, right? It's actually not part of the recovery plans per se, but what it does do is it meets that need to be able to provide an artifact to the executive team, to the board of directors, right? To third parties who are asking about your BCP, to show that you do have a plan in place. But it's a summary, right? And it's usually about 10 pages actually. So it's not giving all the detail. I mean, you don't want to provide all these other documents to the board of directors, for example. They're not going to read all that. They just want the summary that says you've done this work. That's what the BCP summary document does. So it's very important part of the overall package. And there's obviously more I could talk about with terms of the BCP methodology, but let's move on now to talking about how we adapt this BCP methodology and our thinking around that to business transformation. And that business transformation that could include, as I mentioned earlier, right, digital transformation, cloud adoption, changes driven by the pandemic. All those elements and many more are changing how we do business, right? And that means we need to make sure we're accounting for that, right, to keep our plans current. So let's first level set on what is digital transformation, because it's a bit of a buzzword these days. There's a definition there on the left, one of many you can find online. I think this one sums up pretty well. But the bottom line is what you see there on the right, on the right of your screen there. The demand and need for online services and collaboration to stay competitive is driving changes to how we do business, right? We're not just doing this for fun, right? We're not developing all these online capabilities and so on, again, because it's something we just feel like doing. Where organizations are doing that because customers are demanding that, and the pandemic, of course, really drove that. They're demanding that, and certainly staff are also now demanding the ability to work remotely, and they've become accustomed to that over the last couple of years. That's going to be an expectation going forward, that they had that flexibility. So that is changing how we do business, which means we need to account for that in our business continuity plans to keep them current. All right, let's talk a little bit more detail around what this means for business continuity planning. Again, using digital transformation as one example of something that's changing the business. So, let's kind of hit these bullet points here, right? Less paper, more digital, right? That's kind of the obvious. As you have more online, more information that's online. This actually mitigates what we often see as a risk when we're assessing organizations, especially in the past, right? Pre-pandemic, let's think about that in particular. You'd have invoices that come in through the mail that are paper copies, right? Purchase order forms that are all sorts of paper forms that are being used. Finance that prints out everything, absolutely needs to print out documents with the way they work. And anything that's on paper, it's harder to back that up, right? It's hard to make it accessible remotely. So that's a risk, right? If your office goes up in flames or is hit by a tornado or whatever, right? Whatever the crisis is, that paper's gone. So more digital actually gives you more flexibility. It allows you to back up that content. It allows you to, again, make it accessible remotely. It allows people from different locations to collaborate on the same document and so on. So that's actually a good thing for business continuity. The second point, decrease reliance on brick and mortar office locations. Certainly that changes the dynamic when we're thinking about alternate sites for a facility disruption. We know, again, that most of our staff can work from home for a lot of organizations, but there's often at least some staff that need to have an office location, whether it's because they're working with specialized equipment, or they are public facing, they're doing a public facing role, whatever that is, right? But it simplifies things because we're no longer thinking about, well, we have 1,000 people in this location, we need an alternate site that also can host 1,000 people. Maybe we only need to host 10 or 20 people. So that gives us more options. Again, this is a real positive for business continuity. And the third point, mobility, right? 5 years ago, mobility was kind of check my email on my phone, right? Well, now it's, can I work as effectively from anywhere as I would if I was in the office? And we've had to do that, right? We've had to make that happen over the last couple of years. So this has now become a requirement for many, not just a perk. So that also, again, gives us flexibility for business continuity. Let's actually dive into that a little bit more on the next slide, right? What was seen as a burden in the past, BYOD in particular is a good example, right? As it's viewed as a security risk, and another thing to support remote collaboration, same thing, and so on. Now, today, these are just the reality of how we work, and not necessarily bring your own device, but the notion of having flexibility around what device you are using to do your job. And again, that simplifies BCP quite a bit. Same with that. I mentioned about the alternate site options. That's a lot simpler to deal with now, and more flexibility with how you deliver services. Right, those are all positive things, right? So again, you could look at that and say, well, if BCP is so easy now, then why do I still need to worry about it? Well, it's not. It's easier, right? There's still work to be done there, and you still need a BCP. So what hasn't changed? Or let's talk about what has not changed when it comes to an effective business continuity management program. And there's 4 elements I want to call out here. One is you still need to have a good understanding of what your existing business process are, right? Especially as they change over time. We need to understand what the roles are, right? What the dependencies are. All these things that we need to make sure are accounted for in a business continuity plan. We still need an impact analysis. We still need to understand what services are we going to focus on day one, right? Post disruption that are going to be, we're going to try to get up and running. We still need those response plans. How do we respond to a crisis that's a little more sudden than the pandemic was? And we need to maintain the plan. We still need to test it, make sure it's still accurate and current, and drive continuous improvement. So you still need a BCP. It's a little bit different now in terms of the outcomes, the strategies, but it's still absolutely a requirement and a critical piece of your overall resilience strategy. And here's a case study that helps kind of drive some of that home. That notion of having a good BCP actually was a good thing ahead of the pandemic, and it still will be in the future. This is an organization. This case study is of an organization we worked with pre-pandemic, and as part of the main takeaway here on this slide and that previous slide is if you're following good, sound business continuity practices, you are prepared for the unexpected, right? So with this client, we helped them identify and prioritize their processes. We helped them identify their dependencies. We helped them identify risks, like some of those risks I mentioned earlier, the processes that depend on paper that could be a risk, right? Things of that nature. So they sorted all that out. And when the pandemic hit, they were prepared, right? And they actually sent me this really nice email. Here's a quote from that email thanking us for the work we did with them. And I love that last line. It almost made what we had to do easy, right? That's your goal. That's why you work on a business continuity plan, so that yes, there's going to be some chaos, but you're minimizing that chaos. And for the most part, you're ready to go, and you're able to respond quickly and effectively and reduce that business impact. All right, and that covers the first 2 parts. Now I really want to move on to Q&A, but just before we do that, I'm going to hand it over to Lesley to talk about this offer.
Hi, thank you, Frank. So we have a free offer for participants of the conference. It's a free 4-hour business impact assessment. That would have been the first item on your pathway to actually doing a business continuity plan. Some of the benefits of the assessment would include quantifying the impact of a disaster in the event of an IT incident, including security incidents, and also providing key input into what will either help you to develop your business continuity plan or update one that you already have. In doing this assessment for you, we will look at your key business systems, the dependencies of those systems, so what they depend on to be functional, and to estimate the scale of cost associated with 24 hours of downtime. We'll also look at the impact of the goodwill, so the impact of those incidents on goodwill with your customer, your partners, and your staff, as well as an overall estimate of the cost on business systems, particular business systems, in the case of an IT incident, as well as vulnerable systems. So some of your business outcomes for doing this assessment would be insight into your most critical systems and the potential impact of a failure, to give you the direct financial correlation between an IT incident and the cost, as well as to reduce the risk to your business, because you now know what systems are vulnerable and what needs immediate upgrading. So you can join the TTEC booth and register for an opportunity to win 10 free assessments. So there's no way you can lose on this. So go and register to get an opportunity for an impact assessment for your company. Thank you, Frank. I
Excellent.
believe
Were there any questions?
you can.
No, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but we do have a couple of comments, a very brief comments. Daisy Pedley says the third bullet on one of your slides was spot on, ability to work from anywhere.
Right.
And then Wesley added, especially data recovery. So yes, those two. We do have one question here. Nicholas, just coming in. Nicholas says, how do we access the offer for the BCP assessment session?
I think Lesley just mentioned.
You Yeah, so you go to the booth and you register, and there are 10 available. It's a raffle, so we will choose from those who have registered and give away 10 free assessments. So go to
Okay.
the T-Tech booth.
Yes, make sure you visit the booths, especially during the breaks and whenever you have an opportunity to do so. I would also like our participants to answer our second poll question for today as well. Do you want to learn what areas of your business are to be included in your business continuity plan? That seems like a no-brainer, right? Do you want to learn? Simple, yes or no. So that's our second poll question. Click the poll option and you can participate in that poll. I see a couple other comments coming in. All right, no questions so far. No questions for you
I
guys. So
see
I guess that you
one,
did a very good job.
Kalila.
Hmm?
There's one from Lisa. How do we account for ransomware in BCP?
Not
Yeah.
seeing that
So
question. Go ahead though.
So yeah, no, that's a really good question. So one of the things you have to consider when it's a ransomware attack is depending on the scope of it, you might need to also invoke disaster recovery, right? If your complete site is down, for example, you might need to fail over to a clean environment, and so on and so forth. And we can talk more about that. For business continuity, and think about some of the events that we've seen in the news, where sometimes an organization will have systems down for a week or more, but they still have to deliver services. So what that means is you need to have downtime procedures, right? We did talk about that a lot in healthcare. Systems go down, I still need to register patients, I still need to triage, I need to do all those things. So you bring out your paper forms or use alternate means of technology, what have you. You need the way to still deliver critical services while your normal IT systems are down. So, that's the tie-in. Business continuity is one of the tools you have to be able to respond to and manage a ransomware attack to minimize the impact of it.
I have another question. This one comes from Wesley Wright. He says, today everything is in the cloud. Ain't that the truth? What are the factors to consider whether to host in the cloud or on premises?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons to host in the cloud is for greater availability, right? So now cloud does not guarantee uptime. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they all have outages, right? But they tend to not be for days. It's for hours, right? So they tend to be more resilient. But it's important to know that it doesn't guarantee. So one of the factors to consider is if you cannot provide good resilience for your systems on-prem, if you can't afford a DR environment or what have you, then one of the options is can I have it hosted and defer some of that responsibility to the cloud vendor. I still need to think about DR and make sure the vendor is resilient and so on, but it gives me some flexibility for sure.
Well, thank you so much,
But
Frank and
definitely,
Leslie.
Frank.
You want to add,
Excellent.
Leslie?
Well, I wanted to add to that, Kalila, in the sense that one of the major factors is to ensure that you have good internet access. You have
Hmm.
one, two, or three providers, so that
Right.
should,
Hmm.
should anything happen, you can still access your systems in the cloud. So that would be really part of your disaster recovery as well.
Yeah, and as part of just general cloud strategy, you really need to evaluate the
Yeah,
fit for purpose. Not every workload is going to be a good fit for cloud. It could be latency concerns, this could be integration issues, and so on. But strictly from a business continuity perspective, there is the opportunity to gain greater availability by leveraging cloud services depending on the workload.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Frank and Leslie.